staying on. I see that there's some people who are joining in. Thank you very much. You are welcome. I'm going to read Ms. Hani du Toit's bio quickly, and she will be talking about thriving in environments of exclusion and having the courage to change them. Hani is a South African businesswoman who serves in many ways as an inclusion specialist, conversational intelligence coach, a Lego serious play facilitator, an accredited team coach with the European Mentors and Coaches Council. She holds qualifications from UCT, UWC, Cambridge University, as well as the Creating WE Institute. She's committed to the transformation of our society through amplifying the messages of our shared humanity. Hani has 25 years experience in leadership, education, and human development. She has worked locally and abroad with companies, universities, and governments. She has lived and worked in the Middle East, has served as a relief worker with refugees on the Syrian border, and extensively explored parts of Asia, parts of Africa, and Europe, learning how different cultures solve shared human problems. This has left her very aware of our extraordinary capacity as human beings to become adversity, or to overcome adversity, sorry about that, and to innovate and to forgive. Her children's book, Just Like Me, that is the name, has been identified by Wits University as a model for writing about inclusion for children. Her book echoes her belief that if we look through a lens of compassion, we discover a shared humanity. And that is Hani's bio. Hani, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm deeply privileged and honored by the invitation to join the Grand Scale Motivation Summit that's happening online. I'm very pleased to see the extent of UNO's movement as a global movement, and really UNO thrilled to see that that really is what it is. And so I'm hoping, and I also just want to say that, I like the way UNO designed the topic, UNO. So it's not usually the direct focus of mine, but I think it really gave me, as I prepared for this presentation, it really gave me time to reflect on the realities of the pain points which we face as African people in a society that is actually a society designed for power amongst white people. And so the realities that we face, no matter how successful we are, is that we're always navigating that system of supremacy, and we're always needing to deal with the experience of exclusion. And so I think I'm going to open my presentation by inviting everybody to just tell me, if I can just be allowed to share my screen, please. So I'd like to invite everybody to just tell me when we do open the screen to, so just co-host, and then that should be fine.
Uno, please allow Hani to co-host very quickly. Okay, I think while we wait for Uno.
Okay, I see it's on. That's great. Thank you. No problem.
Awesome.
So I want to start by looking at this particular image, and this particular image as an image and everything that it evokes for me about what it is to enter 2021 amidst the various stresses that we've been facing. And so my invitation now is for you to actually use the chat box and share with me in the chat box, what does this image evoke for you, given that I've titled it 2021? So I'd just like to see some of your inputs. What's there for you when you look at this image? What do you see? What emotion does it evoke? What kind of response or reaction do you have when you see this image? and anybody can either unmute and share, or you can. Thank you, Kelvin. Drowning, but I'm still here. So you're welcome to put your responses in the chat, and we can all see them there. Or if you want to raise your hand, then I can possibly and unmute yourself, and I'd be happy to listen to your input as well. And so really it's an invitation for you to just engage. There are going to be a few times, I can tell you, during the session where this is going to be the request I put out to you. Hope in every challenge. Yes, we do just see his hands. It invokes fear and a plea for help. In Lucisa, Charity said, hope in every challenge, maybe. In your words, Charity, I'm reminded of Stevie Smith's poem, Not Waving But Drowning. And the poem goes on to point to how people on the shore think this person is waving, but actually the person's drowning. And so, yeah, drowning but still alive, asking for help. Uno says he agrees with the fear and the plea for help. There is hope. So thank you very much for your responses. I'm still here. I love that. You know, I'm not done yet. So thank you very much for your responses. And the reason why I wanted to start with this, a cry for help or a sign that I'm still alive, is in the coaching work that I do, and I work extensively with leaders in various organizations in different situations, in educational institutions across the Western Cape, in particular in local government, local South African government, and then with clients in different parts of the world. And what comes across consistently to my Mina, I see the Doda, just as hard pressed, but I'm ready to lead the change. And I love that because I feel that this image evokes in me my experience in navigating with clients and organizations the conversations around exclusion. That there's a lot of pain associated to being in an environment of exclusion, that there's a lot of a great experience of isolation, and yet there's this desperate commitment to transform something, a commitment to say, actually, this is enough. I want to get to shore now. I want to start making the difference that there is to be made. So thank you for taking that on, because what I'd like us to explore is what are the various stressors that we've been experiencing at a level of intensity over this last year, 12 months at least. But let's face it, when it comes to exclusion, this is something that's been going on for centuries. And so at a cellular level, at a somatic level, particularly as Africans, we are experiencing a degree of pain, a degree of trauma that can't just be explained by the kinds of things we seem to be facing on a day-to-day, because it does go back generationally. So amongst the things, and thank you, Chiamo, for mentioning my book earlier on, amongst the obvious exclusions are people with abilities, and we often focus on that. This is an image from my book. And it's a child's view of saying, I want to invite Zarina to my party. She wants to be a ballerina just like me. And so this question of just like me is something that, well, it's the title of the children's book, but it's something that's present to the experience of exclusion that this whole presentation is going to speak to. It's the experience of, why do I feel like I can't just be me? Or why do I feel like nobody else wants to be just like me? Or why do I feel like I have to be just like them? And so this experience or this message of, actually, I need to be looking for what that common ground is. I need to be looking for who else has this aspiration. And I don't want to reference it as like-minded, because I think there's a huge danger to us associating only with those who are like-minded, but rather people who share our aspirations. And when we focus on that, then we can experience a great diversity in the circles which we pull around us. So aside from ableism, of course, last year was deeply marked within the pandemic by the Black Lives Matter movement, and in particular, spurred on or intensified by the death of George Floyd. And so what we came up against was this whole pushback of all lives matter, and an absolute denial that there is a particular urgency in addressing exclusion, systemic exclusion, systemic oppression, and systemic killing of Black people, not just in the States, because this rippled out across the world, precisely because the experience is universal. It wasn't limited to the US. And so even in South Africa, we saw an uprising, particularly in our high schools. And of course, this is indicative of how it's the younger generations who are going to be pushing back and who are going to be shining light on where it is we need to take the future. So what I loved about the previous speakers pointing to, what's needed in the world. You don't need to do the market test to the extent that many other people may think they need to, because you can be innovating and creating and providing products and services in response to the needs you have experienced are missing, in response to the gaps you yourself feel. And this is really when I saw people calling on me because of the difference in the approach that I bring to these conversations in response to a need. And listening to, and I liked on that 3 steps, I'm not sure if the doctor's still with us, but on those 4 steps, when she spoke about effectuating, and it had to do with me. And that's counterintuitive to what we've taught in starting out, because we're told to deal with what the market wants. And I very much affirm that actually, if we listen to our own pain points, if we are focused on our own observation of what's needed, then we can actually be very responsive to bringing to market what there is a dire need for. So certainly the Black Lives Matter was one of these pain points. We saw lots of responses, but in particular, I had coaches in different parts of the world who are colleagues of mine in Europe, in the US, in Canada, reaching out and say, we're afraid to make mistakes around this. How do we show our support for this movement and be sensitive to the degree of pain? How do we not burden Black people further by needing to do the work for us? It's an ongoing conversation, and I'm going to speak to what some of the responses are that I have to that question, both for those of us who are Black people, as well as for people who want to show their allyship. So then coming into 2021, I mean, what a horrific start. We had the storm of Capitol Hill in the US and a completely different police response to what George Floyd experienced on the streets in his city. And so we see this counter, right? And I'm going to speak to exactly what starts to show up and what exclusion is all about. It's this experience of polarity. And what these past 12 months has done is to really heighten our experience of polarity. That was January. February saw in New Zealand. So really these issues have been pumping up all over the world. In New Zealand, in Parliament, we had a Maori parliamentarian needing to contest his right to wear the haitiki, which is the neck piece he's wearing in this image, because he was literally thrown out of Parliament because he was not conforming to proper, appropriate parliamentarian wear, which is, it was until February in New Zealand, still a suit and tie for a New Zealand male parliamentarian. And he overturned this with the help of his party, and now he is able to access Parliament, use his voice as a parliamentarian, truly speaking for his right as an Indigenous person to assert his identity in whichever way he sees fit and culturally appropriate. And this is really the power that we want to point to, that there is when at every level, it's not only in our workspaces, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, it's at every level, all the way into Parliament, where people experience exclusion because the system is designed that way. And then, of course, we look more recently. So that was January, February, this is March. And we see on the one hand this victory on the continent, the only African president, Tanzania's Samia Suluhu Hassan, who was inaugurated a week ago. And though it's a victory, it points to the patriarchy in Africa. Why are we a continent as vast as we are, a dispute of between 54 and 56 nations, and one woman president on the continent? And the pressure that this woman is under to transform everything there was to transform by her predecessor in terms of his COVID responses or denial, in terms of collaborating with the opposition party, and in terms of also proving that the conservative culture, the conservative Islamic culture in Tanzania is not going to thwart her role or her power, her practice of power, assertion of her power as president of the nation. But of course, that's amidst the reality that's been pervasive throughout all of this time, heightened gender-based violence, particularly in South Africa. In fact, when our budget reading was done just a few weeks ago, there was a huge, deafening silence in what was the budget allocation to deal with very aggressively, not happening at all to deal with gender-based violence. And so we wonder then, what are the actions that are being taken within the system? And then what does that leave us with? So if I highlight all these realities that we've been contesting with, that we've been contending with, putting up with, dealing with, facing on a macro level and at a micro level, the question I have for you now in the chat is, how do these realities leave you feeling? So I know it may sound like a gloomy start to the presentation, but I want to invite you to just get into that reality. When we look at all of these different pressures that we're actually being pulled into, how does it leave you feeling seeing these things? And it's global, but it's happening. Similar things are happening in your environment. And I'd really like you to take a moment to reflect on how's it showing up in your environment. Unfortunately, I feel that we all know somebody who's probably died within the pandemic of COVID. We probably all know somebody who has had to deal with gender-based violence. We probably all know somebody who was overlooked for leadership because they're not quite the right fit. We'll talk more about that. So these are not things that are only happening at the large spaces in which I've pointed to so far. So my question to you is, please put in the chat, how does this leave you feeling? Or if you'd like to unmute yourself, then I'm absolutely happy to hear you raise a hand or see you raise a hand and unmute yourself and just give us some response. Anyone want to take that up? In the chat then. I think I'm hearing someone. Is somebody unmuting? Simpiwe?
Yes, hi, Hani. So from my side, as much as it's all daunting and gloomy, perhaps, I think I am grateful to be alive at a time where we don't just take things. We have an opportunity to say enough is enough and to actually contribute to finding solutions to these challenges. We're not living in an age where a woman don't have a voice, for example. So we can challenge the status quo, and the fact that issues such as Black Lives Matters, when they came to the fore, Black people didn't shy away, but it was more of enough is enough. And it's more now, less talking, but what are the next actions that we now need to take so that we end the challenges that we faced with. But I'm grateful to be alive at a time where I have an opportunity to contribute to building a better society.
Absolutely, Simpiwe. Thank you so much. What a powerful contribution. And I can hear that. I can hear that stepping up and using your voice. So thank you for entering the conversation with your voice. That's exactly what it's going to take. That in safe conversations and in unsafe conversations, we look to see what's the power that we can bring to that conversation, what's the contribution we can be. I absolutely agree with you that as much as it is daunting, it is the era we are in, and we need to ask ourselves, why are we alive in this era? What is the purpose of us being here, and how do we play our part? So I simply love your contribution. I see Chiamo has also answered by saying, it highlights how exclusion greatly affects me as a Black woman. It leaves me feeling like I'm at the bottom of the barrel. And so sometimes, and I can so get that, Chiama, because I work in the area of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I can tell you, I fluctuate between those two positions, where there are days like today where I'm so grateful there's a contribution I can make, there's a role I have to play. And there are days when I feel like, is it ever going to change? You know, am I ever going to have my expertise and my value taken as is? Or will I always need to prove it? And so, so these are important. It's important to see the continuum that we're always on in this conversation, because our capacity to be thriving in environments of exclusion, first of all, it's a big ask. And secondly, it is variable. It's not a constant. And I think that's a big part of our response, to understand what is the cost, because there is an impact, there is a cost. So thank you very much to for those two contributions. I usually see it as this kind of response, right? So there's this craziness. And when I'm in the experience of exclusion, this is sometimes I want to scream on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's just so much confusion and pain around what's actually going on. How can this be? And Uno and I have been engaged in conversations like this where, you know, we're so clear about the light that needs to be shone onto the issues that are unacceptable practices. And yet it's not as easy as just saying, shine the light, there it is, now let's do something about it. The reality is that it raises for us despair, anger, and frustration for many people, especially when it's generational. So I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and I was very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle as a student activist in the 80s. And so there's a lot of stuff that gets triggered for me, you know, as somebody who was told you can only go to the school, you can only live in this area, you can only do this, we only have so many seats for people of color in this and that faculty. Those were the realities when I was growing up. And so there's a degree of anger, frustration, and desperation sometimes around what can be done. When I work with organizations, I see this all the time as well, that people feel depleted. And so because of this depletion, people take two different responses. They either go full force in or they withdraw, right? And when we withdraw or we go full force in and we have that experience of, I'm just going to take the bull by the horns and say what needs to be done, we tend with both those positions, because they're extreme positions, to be increasing polarity. But what I want to speak to here is this increased polarity is not only for Black people. This increased experience of increased polarity is for every human being. Because as one of my good friends in the diversity inclusion space likes to say, racism is self-harm. Exclusion, exclusionary practices is self-harm. We rob ourselves of human connection. And that's really what brings me to the question of this experience of not being part of, not being a member of the community, standing outside, looking in, wanting what's in the circle, wanting what's in the inner circle, knowing I could contribute something, but feeling that the contribution may not be valued. This is a common experience when I speak to people, or like the terms for entry is actually a price too high to pay. So what are some of those terms or experiences of exclusion? Amongst them, and I'm sure many of you can relate to different aspects of these, is access. So whether this is around who gets access, is it about having the right education? Is it about having the right accent? Is it about showing that you have a certain culture that's shared, this whole sense of culture fit in organizations? What does it actually mean to say that we're seeking people who have a culture fit with us? Is it not telling me a bit about who don't you want to have here? And if we want this homogenous culture, is that about values or is that about perception? And so that's something that can be interrogated when we're facing those issues. But exclusion is also very much about rank, power, and privilege. It is also very much about, will I have access to power? Are those in power willing to share power with, or are they committed to a power over? In a power over dynamic, there's an exclusion around who makes decisions. There is a very close and tight inner circle that not everyone has access to. There's a lack of consultation broadly amongst all stakeholders. So when we look at these factors, we do need to ask ourselves, where am I experiencing exclusion? And even if we are people who are African, and how are we practicing exclusion? Where do we practice exclusion? And this is where it becomes challenging, because this asks us to look a little differently at the scenarios and at the environments we find ourselves in. Other exclusionary practices, microaggressions, we'll talk about that a bit more. Tokenism, I had a client call from the US recently. She works in a huge healthcare company, and she was selected to be profiled in the company's magazine. And she called me and she said, I need some support because I'm very clear that they selected me not because I'm the best. I'm good at what I do, but I've only been there a few months. But because they don't think I'm going to rock the boat because I don't come across as politically active. And I'm a refugee. So there's a certain gratitude I have to the system. And she said, how do I use this opportunity to shine the light on the people who are actually being excluded from this opportunity? And I thought that was a powerful question, because even as a Black woman refugee in the United States, she was saying, there's an access I've been given that's being withheld from my peers. How do I make sure that I include them? And that was really powerful. That was really an opportunity for her to say, so exclusion's not just about what I'm feeling. Sometimes the opportunities that I'm allowed means I close the door on someone else. How do I keep that door open? And so this is something that I invite when I work with Black people. We can't come into the conversation assuming that we're not perpetrators of exclusion. It's not that we're only victims of exclusion. And this is a challenging issue for us when we navigate this terrain. And so that points to the tokenism, but then also meritocracy, which I'm going to speak to. How is meritocracy actually a weapon of exclusion, a weapon of white supremacy? And unfortunately it is, and most unfortunately, most of us who have some degree of success in the world, we have fallen for the weapon of meritocracy. And I'll speak to that in a moment. So what do I mean by microaggressions? And I'm really wanting to expand them, not because we haven't experienced them ourselves, but because of this word micro, right? I mean, at first, and I said, why are people calling this a microaggression when it evokes so often so much indignity, so much disregard or disrespect and hurt? It's a dismissal sometimes of people's humanity. And so this is the simplicity of microaggression, and the micro really speaks to the small intent. So there's no big intent to inflict harm when somebody says, can I touch your hair? And I've experienced people saying to me, do you have good hair under that scarf? You know, or is it something you cover up because it's not good hair? Like, what the hell's good hair, you know? So just this kind of question, where are you really from? And then, of course, there are others. Can you see as much as white people can? This Asian woman is asked, you know, because of your eyes. Like the horror of the blindness, the willful ignorance for the kinds of questions that people actually pose, and yet it's a reality. And then you don't act like a normal Black person, you know? So what does that mean? The responses that I'm left with when I think of the microaggressions I've experienced, I mean, you know, one of them that I like to narrate is I did a facilitation for a C-suite client not so long ago, a couple of years, I think it was the end of 2018. And I had arranged with the CEO that, listen, while you and I have worked together before, your team doesn't know me. So it's really important that you do my introduction very much in the way that Chiamo did so now. And the reality that I was, thank you, Suzko, I get that. I get that completely. You don't sound black. How are you supposed to sound? Here's the interesting thing that I want to point to just around accents and this was in one of my programs recently, and very sadly, one of my participants in a program, and it's a global program, has a very strong isiXhosa accent. And one of the things I noticed is when people had to buddy up and do calls, after a 2-week period of the same kind of homework, nobody contacted her. And when I saw that, I thought, I can't, as the facilitator, notice this and not bring it to the group. And then I said, let's talk about exclusion and how it happens. And I shared what I noticed because the feedback came through, the reporting on their tasks. And when I raised it, people said, no, we love her. But you know what? I didn't want to have a call with her because I'm going to struggle to hear. And I thought, really? We're listening to your accent. You're sitting in the US. We're listening to your colleague's accent. She's sitting in Canada. How come we can adapt to your accent, but it can't happen the other way around? And then I noticed some of my local participants from South Africa were really championing, wanting to keep aligning with an American. I know there are some people from the US on the score. I have nothing against the US, but there's this affinity that we have that something better is not where we are. Something better is out there, and it lives in the Western world, or it lives in a white body, or it lives in the halls of power, in those ivory towers. So yeah, these are experiences of exclusion. They are painful, they are hurtful. Coming back to what my CEO did on the day that I was facilitating, just before I was about to start, when he was going to introduce me, he turned to me and he said, by the way, there's no way I'll sing your praises. You can introduce yourself to the team. And I was, wow, why would you do that just before the event without telling me, honey, I'm not comfortable with this, introduce yourself. I think that'll be better, or convince me, before we'd been negotiating the entire and co-creating the entire event. And on the morning, he tells me, I will not sing your praises. And I couldn't help but wonder, if I was a white man, would I have had that response? So the question I have for you now, and I see some of you have given examples in the chat already, what are your own examples? What are your own experiences of this kind of thing? And I saw that, yes, Suzgo's response, I was told I don't sound black. And what does that then mean about how you're going to relate to me? What your expectations are of me would be my questions. And how did you want me to sound? And what does it mean is where I'm left. So anybody else got a reality of their own experience that they want to share with us? And you can unmute yourself. You can put it in the chat. I'm curious to hear what kinds of responses, what kinds of experiences we've had in this group. So anybody can just give some. You come up with really... I was applying to teach English for the Chinese online school and was told to buy lighter powder to look a bit white. Oh my goodness. Yes, Losiso, unfortunately, this is reality. This is and this is a way in which unfortunately, in which our internalized racism is at play, because unfortunately, these products have long had a market in Africa, has long had a market in Asia, precisely because we have, or generations across, have bought into this idea that if we were lighter, we'd have, and it's called an affinity bias. It's an affinity to whiteness, where often people believe that if you looked whiter and you behaved whiter, then it must mean that you're more intelligent. It must mean that you're more competent, or it must mean that you're more capable. And so unfortunately, this is shocking but true. You reason well for a woman. Oh, Chiamo, you don't want to know all the ones I've got on that. I was a conference speaker once when somebody came up to me and asked me whether I would go to the kitchen and sort out this problem they had with the buffet. And I was like, oh, really? Because I'm wearing a doek, I must be the Muslim catering woman. And so those kinds of assumptions, that people don't see, sits in their bias and brings no interest or curiosity to who are you? who's the real you? What's inside? What's the thinking that you bring? What's the value that you bring? What's the contribution that you bring? What are the dreams that you have? So thank you for those. I'm not sure, Simpiwe, I saw you come on. Were you going to share something with us? Tuso's also got something, or I'm not sure, Tuso, if you're applauding or raising your hand. So Tuso, Simpiwe, Susko, anything you want to put in here when unmute yourself?
Yes, honey, I wanted to say that, oh, sorry.
Is that, go for it. Is that Tuso?
Yes.
Okay, Tuso and then the other person.
I was in a meeting with people from Europe, and we were like all Black people in the meeting, and the host was surprised that there were actually Black people in Italy, and she just made a remark like, so you must have come like from the boat, like from West Africa or something. And she's also Black, but she said that. So I was like, okay. It was a bit interesting. And then there was another guy who made a remark and said, no, we don't all come through that way. But even if you do come through that way, it also shows that there's that exclusion.
So yeah, the degree of assumption and the stories. So what that gives us an insight to Tuso is what's the narrative people are operating from, right? And this is something I'm wanting us as people who experience this to become more mindful of, because if we start to notice what are the little cues that tell us, listen, there's a background narrative here that people have about you. You haven't even spoken to that narrative yet. So why on earth is it being brought into the conversation, you know? So, and I just wanted, was it Simpiwe? Were you going to speak as well? Go
yes.
for it.
So what I wanted to say,
you're welcome to put your camera on. I'd love to be speaking with you.
I'm a bit, okay.
It's no
I don't
judgment.
have the right outfit for the session. But I wanted to share in my experience, and I think it took me a while to actually realize what the person was saying. So I often speak at different events, and I used to travel a lot across the continent with my boss at the time. And it was a very pompous introduction. And if I didn't stop to think about it, I'd probably walk away feeling good, because it would be, you know, I've come with this amazing young woman, and she's African. So all the things that are not or like you shouldn't be praised for, but then he goes on and she's a Zuma. And then once he said all of that, but she's very different for a woman, for an African, for a Zuma. So everything that I am basically falls under a category that actually shouldn't be good, but she's different. So eventually initially I'd let it go, until one day it actually said, why is it so, why is it good that I'm different? I'm everything that my people, so I'm Black, I'm female, I'm a Zuma, and there's nothing wrong with being a Zuma. There's nothing wrong with being a woman. So eventually, one day I actually walked up and greeted, and then said, I'm actually not different. I'm a very proud African Black woman who is a proudly Zuma daughter. Because for a long time, it was, okay, I must be proud that I'm very different to everyone else who's me. Yeah, and so I just wanted to highlight that sometimes we don't realize by someone making you sound different that they're actually insulting you.
Absolutely.
But they're putting it in a way that makes you feel, oh, well, I've made it. Everyone else within my category is not it. Yeah, that's
you're spot on there. And that's really called the demand for exceptionalism. So as Black people, we need to be exceptional to get through the doors. And so we will happily be applauded for being exceptional. But what is that speaking to what the narrative is about what's average? You know? So that's actually what we want to be putting our attention on. Hold on. You know, what are you actually saying? So when people are assuming I'm the caterer, what they're saying is what they know of Muslim women in the Cape is, you know, you guys cook well. I cook bloody well, unashamedly. You know, that's got nothing to do with my ability to be a keynote speaker. They're two completely different things. And I don't have to cover up that I cook well in order for any of my other expertise to be promoted. And this is the thing, you know, it's the boxing that you somehow have exerted some exceptionalism in climbing out of the box. But whose box was it? Who created the box? Who decided what the labels on that box are? And that's what we want to grapple with. So the experiences of exclusion need to be looked at and examined closely. So we don't just talk about how do we counter it. We first need to be able to recognize it. And that's really what I'm wanting us to do now, is to say, listen, if you experience all of that, and I said to you, we were going to talk about meritocracy. And so I just want to look at this and you know, meritocracy, who doesn't want to believe you're brilliant, you're top of your class? Who doesn't want to believe that, you know, you stand out from the pack? You are on this forum, grand scale motivation. We want to be doing stuff on a grand scale, or we would not be associating with UNO. So you're right, we want to be exceptional. The fact that there's so many people here from the various Mandela Washington fellowships, the Obama fellowships, etc. We want to distinguish ourselves. That is a human need. That is not the need of a Black person trying to get away from mediocrity. That is a human desire. And so when we look at this idea of meritocracy, there are two things that I want us to pay attention to. What does it actually tell us the definition is? And this is from dictionary.com, right? An elite group of people whose progress is based on ability and talent rather than class, privilege, and wealth. On the surface, that sounds fantastic. Of course, I should be given position based on my ability and talent rather than my class, rather than my privilege, rather than wealth. But here's an interesting thing. When did this first originate? Look at the bottom of the page. 1955 to 1960, in the midst of the civil rights movement in the US, in the midst of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, they suddenly coined the word meritocracy. Let's face it, people had been fighting class in France and in Europe hundreds of years before. Why was this word suddenly foisted, coined, and then used as the criteria for entry into halls of power? Why? And when we look at it, actually, what you start to see is that it's about having us believe that we're playing on a level playing field now, when in reality, we're not. In reality, we're still overcoming obstacles way beyond what the average guy from the privileged background, from the walls of power, from the generations and generations and generations of university degrees. It's not the same race we're running. It's not the same reality we're facing. It's a very different world. It's a very different paradigm. And therefore, when we do reach the end of the race, we have arrived with a very unique skill set. And that's what we forget. So when I coach people, I'm often dealing with their narratives that are disempowering. The narratives that says, nobody in my village did this before. Maybe I can't do it either. The narrative that says, I'll be the first in my family to have a PhD. I'm feeling the pressure. I'm not sure I can make it. And not owning the narrative to have run the race, overcoming this unique set of obstacles, which for many of us include parents who may not have been literate, people who access to different education beyond basic education, very few resources in the schools that we possibly attended, striving and striving and striving to burn the midnight oil to just be seen as a little better than average. So it's not a level playing field, but this idea of meritocracy is actually a weapon that's been used against us, and we've bought it. We've believed it. And so we exert ourselves often to the detriment of our own well-being. And we don't get that actually there isn't meritocracy. There never was. There never was meritocracy. And so how do we then counter it? How do we then engage these environments? So very quickly, I just want to say why belonging, because my work is usually focused on belonging and my programs are called a world of belonging. How do we co-create a world of belonging? But it's born out of an understanding of the neuroscience of belonging, but also the neuroscience of exclusion. And this really shows the study of the brain and the kind of synapses that happen in the brain when people experience social pain. Social pain is the pain of exclusion, the pain of discrimination, the pain of bigotry, the pain of words, behaviors that keep us out, as opposed to physical pain. So if somebody beats you because you're a woman, you're in physical pain, but you're also having this experience of, I'm this vulnerable woman, right? So there's a double experience. But what I want you to pay attention to here is that the social distress lives and lights up the limbic brain in the same way that physical distress does, but at a higher rate. So this pain center of the brain is heightened in social pain than in physical pain. In fact, MRI scans of the brain indicate that when somebody experiences humiliation in a group or social rejection in a group, that the physical pain is the same as a footballer breaking his leg on a football field. Now that's shocking, because we don't relate to social pain in that way. If somebody broke their leg, you'd see a stretcher come running out, you'd see a team of first aid workers, you'd see everybody load that person on, run them off, put them in an emergency vehicle, take them to specialists to be seen to. There's no reaction when people experience social pain. Often we turn a blind eye because we're embarrassed. We may go and pat them on the back afterwards, but we don't get that the trauma is the same as the person who broke their leg on a football field. So what does this research show us? That the pain of social rejection is equivalent also to somebody who's been in a car crash. That the need to belong is then so intensified that it becomes stronger than our need for safety. And whenever I say this, I actually become quite moved, because imagine we will forego our physical safety in order to experience belonging. That's how desperate we are to be included, that we will put ourselves at risk. You look at university initiation ceremonies and you see the desperate, horrible things people will do to belong to a fraternity, to belong, to be accepted, at injury to themselves. And there have been cases in the media over the last several years that have been shocking. But it also tells us the counter. It tells us the corollary to this, that on the other side of the same coin is that when others show us love, appreciation, respect, and honor, when we have an experience of belonging, it triggers the same centers of joy in the brain, the same centers of connection, the same release of oxytocin as when we eat chocolate, as when we engage in sex with a lover, and when we have drugs. And I mean those drugs that people pay the earth for. So imagine that, and this is an important fact to sit with and to understand why it's critical that we address and transform cultures of exclusion. So what's the approach that I do bring? Because it's no use just harping on that, right? What's the answer? And the framework that I have is called the human framework, that I feel and strongly believe that we need to get back to what it is to be human. And what do I mean by that? I mean, our systems have trained us to be competitive survivors, to be competitive survivors. And as entrepreneurs, you're starting out on your own. You're creating communities that need to offer something distinct from what cruel, competitive corporations are offering. And that means that we need to understand what it is to return to being human. And so what I propose is that instead of engaging in debate about who's right and who's wrong, and the system, instead of debating or talking the academics of critical race theory, which is where some people go with this, what if we returned out of the head space and dropped into our heart space? What if we entered this conversation from a space that is our heart center, a space where we experience courage and care, compassion, and therefore the possibility to be curious. What did they mean when they asked you to lighten your skin? What did they mean when they said, you don't sound like a Black person? What if I got curious in that and I re-engaged that conversation and said, when you said that, what did you mean? What did you intend? How did you want me to feel? But when I'm coming from a space of compassion, not combat, then I can create the connection that this kind of conversation brings. So a heart-centered conversation is about returning to the heart space. And the heart space in Latin is cor, for the heart. In French as well, the word courage comes from that heart space. But compassion is to feel with someone, to suffer even with someone. And so when we say to be in a space of compassion, then what we're actually saying is, how do you and I feel through this conversation together? How do we make sense of this from a feeling space, from navigating from this compassion together? If we both got present to each other's feelings, what else could we bring? And so the invitation of the heart space is really that invitation. But it's also an invitation of self-care. And so I want to go to, what do I mean? I said earlier on, many of the people I deal with talk from their personal narratives, and their personal narratives are often very disempowering. If I looked at myself and the labels that the apartheid government gave me, I would have to walk around calling myself a colored. I do not. I call myself a Black South African. In the system, there was privilege allocated to a very small few. And there was disenfranchised masses, of which my heritage is amongst. But when I look further back, I can say, hold on, let me go even further back. Why? Where did I get the surname from? Du Toit, Du Toit, Du Toit. Where did I get the surname from? And then I look and I see, actually, on my paternal side, there's an ancestry of French Huguenots, people who were fleeing the oppression of Europe and coming to settle here in the Cape. If I look to my maternal side, I've got an ancestry of Indian indentured workers, but I've also got an ancestry of Indonesian royalty, apparently. I often tease my husband about this, that he's married to royalty. But when I look there and I see, why were they brought to the Cape? They were brought by the Dutch as political prisoners. Why? Because they were the Mandelas of their era. They were the ones under the Dutch who were saying, no, we will not be subjugated. And so they were banished to the southern tip of Africa so that they could not thwart the colonialist plans, the imperialist plans of the Dutch in Indonesia, in Java. When I look to that history, when I look to that narrative, to that background, I can own that I come from a long line of fighters, that I come from a long line of political resistors, that I come from a long line of leaders, that I come from a long line of people seeking a better future. And so then I have an obligation to move forward, to bring my contribution. Thanks, Tiama. I have seen your message. I'm going to do my best. So when we shift this narrative and I give up the story around me about who I am, and I create a powerful narrative for myself, I can shift the legacy I'm going to lead. And that's the invitation I want to leave to you. How do you shift the legacy? So yes, you've come from something. What's the gold in what you've come from, in where you've come from, in who you've come from? In all of those things, how do you weave that gold into your current contribution to create a legacy? And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I challenge perceptions in this. As I say, if you think you're looking at a painting here, you're not just looking at a painting, you're actually looking at a world map, but upside down. So how can we challenge our own perceptions of what's happening around us? What's the unlearning we can do? And I usually play a quiz with people, and I'm just going to ask 3 questions, and I'm going to hear from you whether you can answer them. If I asked you, who is the richest man of all time? What kind of answers would I hear? And you can unmute and shout out, we'll just throw it in the chat. The second question is, where's the oldest university, the oldest operating university in the world? And the third question that I have is, when we speak about child brides, which country comes to mind that you think raised the law, the legal age for girls to be married in 2019 to the age of 16? So any of those can go into the chat, and I know I'm asking questions when you should be asking questions now, but I'm just curious to see what kind of responses do you have to any of those questions, and you can unmute and take a jab at any of those answers. Or what I'll do, Uno, is I'll send the quiz as one of the tools, and you can distribute it to the attendees. What people don't realize often, and so I'm going to just move on to some of those answers, and this is about the unlearning. What people don't necessarily know and realize is that Africa is at the heart of those first two questions. The oldest operating university is in Morocco, in Fez, in Northern Africa. Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, was the richest man who ever lived. Richer than Bill Gates, richer than all the billionaires, the Bezos and everybody else. And we don't focus on that. We're not taught that history. So we don't take African pride in who we are and where we come from. Child brides is not something that is a problem, an African problem. The legislature was passed in Louisiana in the United States in 2019, raising the age of child brides or of young women to be married legally to 16. So just getting present to those says for all of us, there's something to unlearn in the way history has been given to us, in the way our story is being told to us. And there are lots of resources we could use to go and do that unlearning. This is one by one of my good friends. But a big part of our unlearning is to look in the mirror and to ask ourselves, what are our own beliefs about women, perhaps? And I'm asking the women, you know, my daughter does my mirror work with me. This is my daughter on the screen at the moment. And she is the one who challenges me and my ideas of what it is to be a woman in the 21st century. You're only seeing half of the piercings in her head, let me tell you. In this image, there are at least 8 that are visible, but she's probably got about 18. What are my biases about who women need to be in order to be respected, in order to make a contribution? How can we play catch yourself games with regards to your own bias? And then what is it that you can amplify? What gifts can you amplify in your own uniqueness? And who can you be an ally to? And that's also asking and inviting the men on this call. Are you an ally when it comes to gender-based violence? Are you speaking up? Are you activating all of yourself? You know, bringing your heart, your eyes, your hands, your mouth to your allyship to women. And then are you inviting your white friends, the people who have privilege and power and rank, to become allies? Are you inviting them to take on these conversations? Because the last N in that human framework is to ask about what's next, what now? If we see everything that needs to be addressed, if we looked and dealt with ourselves and expanded our own view and held the mirror up at ourselves, what now? How do we take these ripples of conversation out into the world? In the 80s, in the anti-apartheid struggle, we had a slogan, each one, teach one. And I like to believe that the ripple effect is something you got present to about yourself and your environment and the exclusions you experience. What can you teach someone else about that from your participating here today? So that's where I'm going to stop. Chiamo, I apologize that I've taken every last minute you gave me. And I would like to, I did get quite a bit of participation from the participants here.